driven to do so by his own severe regulations, he had had his treasures deposited for safety with them. He was astounded to see how quickly the knights calmed the popular uprising. At the same time, he was filled with fear because he had seen how great was the moral power of the knights over the people, and how little he, who was only inspired by gold, availed against them. The knights, too, had by this time acquired rich treasure and were immensely wealthy, but according to their rules, they were obliged to place all the riches of the order in the service of spiritual activity and creative work. When a passion is so strong as avarice was in Philip the Fair, it presses out strong forces from the soul that have a great influence on the unfolding of the will toward other men. To the nation, Philip counted for little, but he meant much to those who were his vassals, and these constituted a great host. He also understood how to use his power. As Pope Boniface had once opposed his will to make the clergy in France pay as much as possible, Philip hatched a plot against him. Boniface was freed by his followers, but he died of grief soon after. This was at the time when Philip undertook to bring the entire church completely under his control, thereby making church officials mere bondsmen of the kingly power in which gold ruled. He thereupon caused the removal of the Pope to Avignon, which marked the beginning of what is often known in history as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. This lasted from the year 1309 to 1377. Pope Clement V, former Bishop of Bordeaux, resided in Avignon and was a tool completely in the hands of Philip. Gradually, under the working of Philip's powerful will, he had reached the point of having no longer a will of his own, but used his ecclesiastical power only to serve Philip, carrying out all he desired. Philip was filled with a passionate desire to make himself master of all the then available wealth. After he had seen what a different significance gold could have in other hands, it was no wonder that he wished above all things to exterminate those other hands, the Knights Templar, so that he might confiscate their gold and possess their treasure himself. Now, I said that such a passion, aroused in such a materialistic way and working so intensely, creates powerful forces in the soul. At the same time, it creates knowledge, although of an Ahrimanic order. So it was possible for a certain second-hand sort of knowledge to arise in the soul of Philip, of those methods that we have seen flame up in the harshest, most horrible way in the Mexican mysteries. The knowledge arose in Philip of what can be brought about by taking life in the correct way, although in a different, more indirect way from that of the Mexican initiates. As if out of deep subconscious impulses, he found the means of incorporating such impulses into humanity's evolution by putting men to death. For this, he needed victims. In a quite remarkable way, this devilish instinct of Philip's harmonized with what developed of necessity in the bosom of the knights, resulting from the dedication of their lives to the things I have indicated. Naturally, where something great and noble arises, as it did among the Knights Templar, much that does not belong, perhaps even immorality, becomes attached to that greatness and nobleness. There were, of course, knights who could be reproached for all sorts of things, that shall not be denied. But there was nothing of this kind in the spirit of the foundation of the order, for what the knights had accomplished for Jerusalem stood first, and then what could be accomplished for the Christianizing of the whole of European culture. Gradually the knights spread out in highly influential societies over England, France, Spain, part of Italy and Central Europe. They spread everywhere. In each single knight was developed to the highest degree this complete penetration of the soul with the feeling and experience of the mystery of Golgotha, and of all that is connected with the Christian impulse. The force of this union with the Christ was strong and intensive. He was a true Knight Templar who no longer knew anything of himself, but when he felt, he let the Christ feel in him. When he thought, he let the Christ think in him. When he was filled with enthusiasm, he let the Christ in him be enthusiastic. There were perhaps few in whom this ideal had worked a complete transformation, a metamorphosis of the soul life, and who had really often brought the soul out of the body and enabled it to live in the spiritual world, but in respect of the entire order they were, for all that, a considerable number. Something quite remarkable and powerful had thus entered into the circle of the Templar order without their having known the rules of the Christian initiation other than through sacrificial service. At first in the Crusades, then in the spiritual work in Europe, their souls were so inspired by intense devotion to the Christian impulse and the mystery of Golgotha that consequently many knights experienced a Christian initiation. We have before us the following world historical event, on the world historical basis of the experience of a number of men, the Christian initiation, which is to say the perception of those spiritual worlds that are accessible to men through Christian initiation, arises from the fundamental depths of human development. Such events always call forth opposing forces, which, indeed, in those times were abundantly at hand. What thus enters the world is not only loved, it is also excessively hated. In Philip, however, there was less hatred than the desire to rid the world of such a society and to filch from it the treasure that had flowed abundantly to it, and that was used only in the service of the Spirit. Now in such an initiation as was experienced by a number of the knights, there is always the possibility of perceiving not only the beneficent, the divine, but also the luciferic and Ahrimanic forces. All that draws men down into the Ahrimanic world and up into the luciferic, appears, to him who goes through such an initiation, side by side with the insight into the normal worlds. The one thus initiated is confronted with all the sufferings, temptations and trials that come upon man through the powers hostile to good. He has moments in which the good spiritual world disappears before his spiritual gaze, the gaze of his soul, and he sees himself as though imprisoned by what tries to gain power over him. He sees himself in the hands of the Ahrimanic luciferic forces that wish to seize him to gain control of his willing, feeling, thinking and sense perception. These, indeed, are spiritual trials that are well known from the descriptions of those who have seen into the spiritual world. There were many in the circle of the Knights Templar who could gain a deep insight into the mystery of Golgotha, and its meaning and into Christian symbolism as it had taken shape through the development of the Last Supper. They beheld as well the deep background of this symbolism. Many a one who in consequence of his Christian initiation could look into the Christian impulses passing through the historical evolution of the European peoples, also saw something else. He experienced it in his own soul, as it were, since it always again came over him as a temptation. Recognizing the unconscious capabilities of the human soul, he repeatedly overcame the temptation that showed itself to him. The initiate thus became conscious of it, and sought to overcome what otherwise remained in the subconscious. Many knights learn to know the devilish urge that takes possession of the will and feeling to debase the mystery of Golgotha. In the dream pictures by which many such initiates were haunted, appeared in vision the reverse, as it were, of the veneration of the symbol of the crucifix. This was possible owing to the way in which the initiation had come about, and particularly because the luciferic forces had stood close by with their temptation. He saw in vision how the human soul could become capable of dishonoring the symbol of the cross and the holy ritual of the consecration of the host. He saw those human forces that urged men to return to ancient paganism, to worship what the pagans worshipped and to scorn the advance to Christianity. These men knew how the human soul could succumb to such temptations since they had to overcome it consciously. You are looking here into a life of soul of which outer history relates but little. Philip the Fair, through his Ahrimanic gold initiation, had also a correct knowledge of these facts of soul life, even if only instinctively. He knew enough of it, however, to be able to communicate it to his vassals. Now, after a cruel judicial process had been contrived involving all manner of investigation, a course of action, decided upon beforehand, was begun. Plots were made, instigated by Philip together with his vassals who had been summoned to make investigations against the knights. Although they were innocent, they were accused of every imaginable vice. One day in France they were suddenly attacked and thrown into prison. During their confinement their treasures were seized. Trials were now arranged in which, entirely under the influence of Philip, torture was extensively employed. Every knight to be found was subjected to the severest torture. Here, therefore, torture was also used to take life, the significance of which you have already learned to know. The intention of Philip was to put to the rack as many persons as possible, and the torture was applied in the most cruel way so that many of the harassed knights lost consciousness. Philip knew that the pictures of the temptations emerged when, in terrible agony on the rack, their consciousness became clouded. He knew the images of temptation come out. Under his instigation, a catechism of leading questions was so arranged that the answers were always suggested in the way the questions were put. The knight's answers were, of course, given out of a consciousness dulled by the torture. They were asked, "Have you denied the host and refrained from speaking the words of consecration?" In their clouded consciousness, the knights acknowledged these things. The powers opposing the good spoke out of their vision, and whereas in their conscious life they brought the deepest reverence to the symbol of the cross and the crucifix, they now accused themselves of spitting upon it. They accused themselves of the most dreadful crimes, which normally lived in their subconscious as temptations.